Redwood Bummer is the title of a story by Scott Peterson, who you might have heard his voice a little bit earlier. He called a few hours ago and talked on the phone with me for a little bit. He generally does that. Redwood Bummer. Scott Peterson wrote, "You've probably heard the story. Courageous Albion women save Mother Earth from the timber industry. You're likely to know the storytellers as well, Beth Bosk and Sia Catalini, and perhaps a tale or two about La Tigresa, a bare-breasted protester named Dona Nieto, who stopped logging dead in its tracks. What you haven't heard may be a surprise that as time has unfolded, it all turned out to be the other way around." The roots of this story begin at the Registry of Charitable Trusts in Sacramento, with a nonprofit called Friends of the Enchanted Meadow, FOEM, and a series of emails between me and Ms. Bosk. Nonprofits in the Emerald Triangle are my main area of interest, especially those with phony federal employer identification numbers, like the Coastal Land Trust, say. Even more so when nonprofits like that suddenly disappear, like the Coastal Land Trust did. Before that disappearance, the Coastal Land Trust transferred a good-sized chunk of Albion River bottomland to Friends of Enchanted Meadow, FOEM. The date of that transfer was December 31, 2014. The value was $48,570, and the method of determining that value was, quote, cost basis. Then the Coastal Land Trust went bye-bye. According to an FOEM filing for that year, the amount received was actually 20 times less, but the following year it all disappeared. The exact loss was $146,319. In 1 year, over one-third of FOEM's assets just fucking vanished. Poof. FOEM's website has an email address on it. It's info@friendsoфenchantedmeadow.org. It identifies Ms. Catalini as the head honcho there as well, so I dropped her an email to see what happened to all those assets. Crickets, leaving me to contact Ms. Bosk with the same inquiry. That's when all hell broke loose. Ms. Bosk informed me that Friends of Enchanted Meadow has no assets whatsoever. None. And that anyone who says otherwise is full of crap. That didn't seem like a very nice thing to say about Ms. Catalini, especially since she'd declared $396,828 in FOEM assets on May 13, 2015. So I asked Ms. Bosk if Ms. Catalini was full of crap or if she was held to a different standard. What came next surprised me. That $396,828 does not represent a slush fund, Bosk told me, which is funny because in a previous statement she insisted on having no first-hand knowledge of Friends of Enchanted Meadow finances. Ms. Bosk went on to say that Friends of Enchanted Meadow's only assets were 3 sacred land tracts, but didn't seem concerned that a third of them, or which third, had been lost. Bosk went on to promise that if I published anything unflattering about Ms. Catalini, that she'd help her seek redress. She clarified that statement in a later email. Quote, "I'm not threatening to sue you," she wrote. "I am offering you the opportunity to hear a longer story, which, if you've ever listened to Beth Bosk, is worse than being sued. Assuming that Ms. Bosk's listening skills are up to her fondness for storytelling, she might be interested in other perspectives on Redwood Summer, particularly one from somebody I've known for a long, long time, a logger named Jerry Philbrick. Logging ranks as the most dangerous job in the country. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there were 91.3 deaths per 100,000 workers back in 2013. Mr. Philbrick ran Philbrick Logging for 60 years, never lost a man. The closest he came was in 1974 at Gulch 11 on the 10-Mile River. Bob Defer and Bill Reed were falling timber on GP property then. Philbrick had just cut a load in with a bulldozer to get the logs out. Reed dropped a redwood on top of a madrone tree, breaking the madrone in half. While Reed was bucking the redwood into logs, the standing half of the madrone fell on him. Bob Defer noticed that Bill's chainsaw wasn't making any noise, Philbrick recalled, so he yelled for him and couldn't get an answer. That's when he found him all busted up. Philbrick told me it was the road that saved Reed's life. They were able to get a truck from the landing to him pretty quickly. When the ambulance showed up at the landing, Bill was already turning blue, Jerry told me. He'd never have made it without that road. That's what started the Enchanted Meadow logging protests in 1987. A road. Beth Michelle Bosk was born on May 4, 1938. That's according to Mendocino County Clerk records. Her original voter registration there is dated July 28, 1997. Bosk has an online bio for a book titled The New Settler Interviews, Boogie on the Brink. According to that, she's lived here since the late 60s. Bosk reportedly had fled the riot-torn streets of Cleveland, Ohio, for the Mendocino coast with 2 sons. One of them, she claims, was nearly born in a Cleveland jail. That account dovetails with hers and Mr. Philbrick's recollection of coaching one of them on the Mendocino High School football team. Philbrick coached me there as well. He always, and I mean always, showed up to football games with a Super 8 movie camera, filming both junior varsity and varsity contests from beginning to end. That was in addition to running a logging business. Why? I really enjoyed watching young players improve, Philbrick told me, especially when they moved from junior varsity to varsity. Philbrick told me it wasn't about winning at all. It was all about learning. And thanks to Jerry, our varsity team won a Northwestern League pennant in 1970. Jerry's pushing 80 now, but his memory's pretty darn good. So I asked if he ever remembered Beth Bosk doing anything like that. He couldn't. What about waiting tables, stocking shelves, or working cash register? Negative. Did she ever apply for a job at his company? No. Did she ever meet her son's father? Did he ever meet her son's father? I might have, Philbrick said, but it could have been his stepfather. I'm not sure. One thing Philbrick remembers for certain, and that was a zero-tolerance policy for drugs and alcohol on the job. Bosk published a piece accusing Philbrick and several employees of being skunk drunk at a weekday Fort Bragg vigil for Judy Berry in 1990. Philbrick denies that flatly. Did he ever smell pot at a timber protest? Oh, sure, he told me. I also smelled patchouli oil there, the stuff they used to cover it up. Monkey wrenching was a big problem for Philbrick back then. A $500,000 yarder of his up on High Chute Ridge got torched around 1990. CAL FIRE investigated that and found it was arson, Philbrick said. It was fairly close to a trespass marijuana patch. We left the garden alone, but figured it was the grower that burned up the yarder to keep us away. It was a total loss. Philbrick had a similar problem in Alpine Gulch on the Noyo, where somebody took a hacksaw to a haulback line for another of his yarders there. Why? There was a marijuana garden nearby, he said. At no point in our interview did Jerry try to direct my story one way or the other, and unlike Beth Bosk, he never threatened me with, quote, redress over anything. If anything, he shared a healthy disdain for lopsided lectures. I went to a meeting in Willits long ago, he told me. Judy Berry was there. One Earth First guy was dominating the whole thing, so I got mad and spoke up. If anybody damages my equipment or hurts my employees, the shit's going to hit the fan. Philbrick told me that some took that as a threat, but not Berry. She told me I was a stand-up guy, Philbrick said. The connection between logging protesters and trespass marijuana growers was obvious to me. Wouldn't pot farmers have a vested interest in keeping loggers away? That did cross my mind, Philbrick said. Income inequality is another issue. Top-notch fallers maxed out at $40,000 a year. And they worked for scale, meaning that logging protests took money right out of their pockets, while their outlaw counterparts made 10 times that amount with plenty of free time to protest. Did Philbrick's workers ever complain about that? No, Jerry told me, they didn't. Bosk's claim to fame is a single publication called New Settler Interview and has been promoted as bi-monthly. She also had a radio show on KZYX, which is now bi-never. One interviewee is an accomplished author who got miffed at Bosk's literacy lapse. Apparently the queen of passive aggression, Bosk, substituted the word anecdote for the word antidote in one such interview. When the contributor asked Bosk to make a correction, Bosk refused, chastising the writer for her feet of clay. The writer found that response unsettling and stopped playing ball. Today, Bosk's publishing is pretty much limited to by Facebook, where she boasts a whopping 60 followers. Is that A lot? I don't know. I don't do Facebook. I'll just continue reading. Sorry. Just trying to figure out what I'm reading. Claudia Catalini was born on July 13, 1952, according to Mendocino County voter rolls. Her original registration date there is April 18, 1992. But according to her online bio, she moved here in 1972, caretaking her aunt's, quote, abandoned property, living, quote, in a little shell of a cabin surrounded by forest and pygmy prairie and huckleberries. Right, just like Walden Pond, but hemmed in by acres of dope. Mendocino Superior Court records revealed that Miss Catalini was named in 6 legal actions between 1990 and 1994, 4 of them as plaintiff pro per, meaning a lawyer with a fool for a client. One of those lawsuits was against a Mendocino midwife named Carla Stange, S-T-A-N-G-E. I think that's how to pronounce it. I may be wrong. According to Ms. Stange's website, she has delivered over 1,000 babies in her 20-year career as a certified nurse midwife. Some of them were delivered alive. Some weren't. One of them, as suggested by Ms. Catalini's website, was hers. On that website, Claudia blames a lawsuit against her for the death of her child. That lawsuit had been filed by Louisiana Pacific against Catalini, Bosque, and others for trespassing on the timberland LP was trying to bulldoze a road on, just like the one Jerry Philbrick had done at Gulch 11 on the 10 Mile River back in 1974, the road that saved Bill Reed's life. The deceased child was a baby girl named Toka, born on the land, meaning not in a hospital. The father isn't mentioned. Okay, where I come from, which is here, the birth of any child involves 4 people: the mother, the father, the doctor, and the baby. The child isn't named until it's born alive, which is generally with a doctor present. Miss Catalini apparently chose to bypass these mere formalities and squeeze the lifeless baby out onto the floor of a teepee. Fine. Home birth is a fringe practice, according to the New York Times. Little was known just how fringe that was until lately, when the New York Times reported the death rate for home births was 7 times greater than babies delivered in a hospital. But Catalini obviously doesn't read the New York Times. Fair enough, but what does she read? It's not the law, that's pretty obvious. She walked her pregnant self onto commercial timberland like she owned it, and then challenged the would-be oppressors to mess with her. Like Al-Qaeda, only the suicide vest was strapped to an expectant mother. Toka's death is no greater or lesser than that of anyone who perishes in a timber production zone, also known as a TPZ. Well, Philbrick's safety record sparkled. The one for Earth First sure the hell didn't. David Gypsy Chain is a protester who died in 1998 when faller A.E. Ammons dropped a redwood tree on him near Redway. Watch a YouTube video of someone falling a redwood tree with the sound turned up all the way. Then tell me where you'd want to be, inside a TPZ or outside. Then we have the issue of tree spiking. When protesters drive steel rods at precise angles and locations into redwood trees to, well, injure timber workers. That practice was perfected by an Earth First co-founder named Dave Foreman. Judy Berry of Earth First rejected that practice, but not Beth Bosque. In a 1990 interview, she can be seen goading Berry into accepting it. Spike a tree for Jesus, Bosque chanted in a 1990 interview. Berry never took the bait, immediately renouncing tree spiking, but not before somebody got hurt over it. George Alexander worked as a sawyer at the Cloverdale sawmill 3 years before. He was a third-generation mill worker there, but not for long. It was May 1987, the Washington Post reported. Alexander was 23. He was nearly 3 feet away when the log hit his saw, and the saw blade exploded. One half of the blade stuck in the log. The other half hit Alexander in the head, tearing through his safety helmet and face shield. His face was slashed from eye to chin. His teeth were smashed, and his jaw was cut in half. The timing of that accident matches perfectly with Catalini's memoir. Saw logs from Mendocino coast were transported regularly to the sawmill at Cloverdale. The ones from Albion went through Pardini logging in Boonville. Jerry gave me Manchured Robert Pardini's phone number, Mancherd, Mancherd, to check it out. So I did. Robert Pardini's a carefully spoken man. To say otherwise would be a disservice to everyone. He remembered Enchanted Meadow as something he'd rather forget, but wanted to think it over for a couple of days and then get back to me. Deal. In the meantime, I took a gander at Friends of Enchanted Meadow's website to see what the drum circle people have to show for 25 years of old-growth forest preservation versus my humble abode, to compare what one 64-year-old man has done in a fraction of that time. Well, I don't have a website, but I've got a trail, something that snakes its way through redwoods just as old as the ones at Enchanted Meadow, and it got done for a fraction of the price without a 501c3 nonprofit money laundering. In the spring of 1989, LP filed 2 timber harvest plans, also known as THPs, for property they owned on the north side of the Albion River in the area between Duck Pond Gulch and the Boom. The lumber market was at an all-time high then, as were marijuana prices. Outdoor skunk was fetching upwards of $5,000 a pound. Something had to give. Naturally, it was the loggers. Bosk and Catalini tied them up in court first, starting with a lawsuit against the California Department of Forestry on behalf of Friends of Enchanted Meadow. That was followed by another lawsuit and another. In May of 1992, a marathon event took place there as 100 or so fired-up protesters occupied LP's property. Then LP did the unthinkable. They sued. So Bosk and Catalini sued them back under the premise that trespassing on private property is somehow protected by the U.S. Constitution. As usual, they represented themselves. What followed was entirely predictable. Bosk had been egging Judy Berry on for a long time, while Catalini was the main organizer for the massive protest. So LP hit them with everything they had. The legal documents I received were about the size of a cord of wood, Catalini wrote. It became a living nightmare. Imagine that. Like Redwood siding, LP's lawsuit against Bosk and Catalini was cut and dried. When and not if they lost, they'd be liable for lost wages and legal fees. Filings the size of a cord of wood don't come cheap. As all the growers who'd thrown their weight behind the protest suddenly got cold feet, the 2 Earth Mothers, Bosk and Catalini, ran out of wiggle room. So in February of 1997, they cut a deal with LP. One tiny thing that Bosk and Catalini should have read before doing that is called Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Coleridge, where a sailor is punished for killing an albatross by wearing the dead bird's carcass around his neck. Well, that's exactly what Bosk and Catalini got, something they'll be wearing for a long, long time. That settlement transferred 3 prime pieces of timberland to the 2 women. One heavily wooded piece known as Raven's Call, a piece of marshland known as Enchanted Meadow, and a third connecting the 2 named for Catalini's father, Albert. None of them have a road, nor are they ever likely to. The entire property was landlocked by LP, meaning that it's a true wildlife sanctuary, and something that Bosk and Catalini had to start paying insurance and property taxes on. Necessity is the mother of invention, so they got creative. Bosk dropped the Enchanted Meadow property like a hot rock onto the Coastal Land Trust, who in turn dumped it on Claudia Catalini. She saw forming a nonprofit corporation as the perfect way to avoid paying taxes. Thus, in October of 2001, harvest time, she did just that, sort of. Running a corporation requires paperwork, especially when it's a nonprofit. The state of California requires filings called an annual renewal fee report every year, along with a $25 filing fee. The IRS requires a Form 990 as well. That requires an accountant and even more money. In addition, there are late fees, and that's on top of insurance and property taxes. You get the picture. Well, Claudia didn't. That appears to have slipped Catalini's mind, prompting Jerry Brown to send her a little reminder on August 23, 2014, requesting 5 years' worth of paperwork and all fees associated with that. That was something Miss Catalini couldn't afford to ignore, so she dug into her pocket again and coughed everything up, then financed it all with a raffle. When digging yourself into a hole, the first rule is to stop digging. Claudia has yet to figure that out. Raffles in the Golden State require even more paperwork, especially when you advertise them on your website. That's what Catalini did. So Jerry Brown sent her another notice to either register or face the music from the local district attorney. Catalini responded with a delinquent registration application for the year ending August 31, 2016. That application was declined in a letter dated August 2, 2017. Friends of Enchanted Meadows Outlaw Raffle was held on Feb 20, 2016. Catalini's website declared it a success and said that the proceeds would pay for insurance and property taxes into late 2017. And if anything was left over, she promised to focus on completing a trail from the Enchanted Meadow all the way to Raven's Call. Translation: after 25 years of promises, there's still no public access to Catalini's property. Ironically, Catalini finds herself in a position today where she really needs to log that property, but can't. The only road is on the piece named after her father, but it's blocked by downed trees. Claudia reported, "This cleanup will involve chainsaws, and we hope to use the salvaged wood for fundraising. Good luck with that idea." Claudia: "If by some miracle Catalini could actually get logging equipment into that property, there's still the issue of tree spiking to deal with. 25 years of natural growth has long covered up any trace of where they might have been hidden. And the minute somebody fires up a chainsaw in Raven's Call, well, watch out for the neighbors, Claudia." Jerry Philbrick had nothing but kind words for Judy Berry. "I went to visit her when she got sick," he said. "She died 4 days later. Jerry told me he even offered to brew some tea out of madrone bark to make her feel better. Philbrick was hospitalized recently, too. We almost lost him," his wife Terry recalled. "That made me wonder if Beth Bosk ever visited Philbrick while he was in the hospital, or if she ever sent him a card." Terry responded lickety-split. "Beth Bosk did not visit him," she said. "Not a peep." Well, those are a lot of details that I knew nothing about before I read that just now. That was a piece... Wow, that was longer than I realized. Called Redwood Bummer by Scott M. Peterson. And you'll probably find it in the Anderson Valley Advertiser soon. Something caught my eye. The business about worrying about there being spikes in some of those trees when she goes to log them, or even to cut them up if they fell across the road and they had spikes in them. It wouldn't be too hard to make a device to sense spikes in trees. It wouldn't have to be big, and anybody with a saw could carry this device in with him. It would look like one of those things that old men used to go through sandboxes and playgrounds on schools with on Saturdays. I remember from a long time ago. I remember that from when I lived in Fresno. When I was in 5th grade in 1968, there was an old man who would come around the school. We would all go and play there after school and, on the weekends. We'd play on the swings and stuff. And there was an old man who would come around with this thing. It looked like a broom. It had a ring on the end of it and a box, and he had a pair of headphones on, and it had a meter on it. They still make those things. You could make one of those very easily that would be sensitive enough to find a spike anywhere in a tree. You just wave it over where you were going to cut. That would make it safe. I would be willing to help with that if that ever becomes necessary. I would be happy to help with that.